technology progresses, it enables societies to advance. But innovations need to be understood and trusted and lift us all. In AI, medical, space, climate, technology unlocks human potential. And rules we design today are as important as the technology we create. It's how business delivers technology safely into our hands, and how countries leverage innovation. This partnership between transformative technology and purposeful policy drives growth, ensures investment, builds better societies, and powers human progress. We make innovation work for the world.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on our event. I think we are live on YouTube, and I think this is being streamed also over LinkedIn. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in. So the topic of today is space militarization in the era of commercialization, which is quite a few big themes and mouthfuls. So we're hoping that for the next few minutes, we get a chance to explore some of the ideas. It'll be a high-level conversation. I'm very, very excited to have Mr. Dave Davis with us. He's the technical director at ST Engineering iDirect. Dave, would you please go ahead and introduce yourself? And then we're going to jump in or up as the space demands into the theme.
Yeah, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everybody. So I'm Dave Davis. I'm a senior technical director at ST Engineering iDirect. And our technology underpins a lot of the satellites that everybody's familiar out there. We provide the core infrastructure that sits underneath and the technology that connects it all together. And my specific role is I look after the global government side of the technology. So I look after everything outside of the US. We have a proxy company within the US called iDirect Government that looks after that side. And I'm the lead technical guy for everything outside of the US on what we do, but also advising our partners and our end users on how our technology can be used, but also guide them in where they can use other technologies alongside ours as well.
Thanks, Dave. So yes, we're very excited to have you as our speaker for today on this theme. I know you have a lot of experience around it, both professionally and I think your personal passions as well. I see the nice collection behind you. I cannot be sporting the same over here, but my collection will grow, I'm sure. So to touch very lightly upon what brought forth this conversation, I think it's pretty evident that this trend has been going on for some years. One would say space and defense are very much married themes born from one and the other, but certainly space commercialization has opened up new avenues and new doors away from the defense heritage, if one could call it that way, from space. But with increasing conflict or with increasing new technologies, we also see these themes coming closer again. And so I'd love to explore and hear your thoughts and trends, predictions going on how you think this will happen and continue in the future and in what situation we're in. So let's get into it. What is space militarization in your opinion, and is it a new phenomenon? Feel free to disagree with my intro there.
Yeah, sort of almost we've come full circle. So space initially was it was the sort of national government programs that were exploiting space and accessing space in the first place. And predominantly, particularly in the early years, it was the militarization of space that was driving a lot of the necessity for the spacecraft that were up there. And over a period of time, it's gone from sort of like weather monitoring, Earth observation, both in visible spectrum in sort of infrared, and then navigation through position navigation and timing systems like GLONASS or GPS, and then ultimately sort of like the main use that most people think about is the communications, whether that's one-way broadcast communications or two-way sort of tactical or strategic communications. And over probably the last sort of like 4 decades, we've seen a swing from that military use to then more of a commercial use and a commercial exploitation. And if you just look at launch vehicles that have been put up there, there's now a complete swing the other way, that it's predominantly commercial platforms that are going up there and not military. And what we're seeing is there still are sovereign assets up there, and there's still sovereign assets that are launched on a regular basis, but predominantly there's an exploitation of commercial assets in addition to the exploitation of the military assets. So military forces are using more and more commercial technology, and we get this this term that's used of dual use, where you see an equipment can be used in both a military and a commercial context. But actually these days there's more out and out commercial equipment that's out there that is being used for military purposes. And that could be sort of anything like a Starlink sort of like type of communications, to sort of like broadcast communications as well. So it's across the whole spectrum, including Earth observation, and we've seen in some recent conflicts where the use of commercial Earth observation is actually getting access much faster and in much more detail than you would have in your traditional military asset that's up on the on station. So we're seeing that shift, and that change of pace is increasing and accelerating.
Interesting. Yeah, I would say that it's rather symbiotic and evident in market demand. Governments, especially spacefaring nations, are also turning to commercial companies to provide them with space data or encrypted communications, or rather closed comms channels. So it seems very much one has nurtured the other. In your sense, then, moving into how commercialization is changing this relationship, how do you think it's changed the space defense arena? I mean, you touched on it, that there's commercialization, which is the primary trend, but what has it done for the two space defense themes together? Any sort of major outcomes?
Yeah, I think initially it's increased the speed, the throughputs that you're getting, and also the speed of change, because traditionally it was the defense budgets that were driving research and development. That has now switched completely on its head, where it's now the commercial entities that are putting that money in there and getting those systems out. And if you just look at the pace of change on things like the SpaceX Starlink system, Amazon Kuiper, it's a sort of like an order of magnitude over how we're developing. So I think it's that access, but also the cost. The cost is being driven right down, and in some cases in the military purposes, you don't necessarily need a full grade encrypted system. You could have a sort of a blend of various different systems depending on what you need. And sometimes you can use a completely open system if that information that's being passed is going to be completely irrelevant to anybody in 10, 15 minutes time. So you can use the commercial system almost without encryption, without any security, and complete the mission and then go off somewhere else. But there will be some times where you do need that complete sovereign hardened asset, fully encrypted, that is going to keep those secrets secret for a long period of time. So it's that blend and that balance that we have. And it's like some people talk about it as a golf bag approach or a toolbox approach. Use the right tool for the right applications.
Yeah, well, with a plethora of new options, I suppose most companies tend to diversify, and an interesting trend as well is new space companies have to be both civil and defense capable companies, which I think is opening up new broads. To perhaps early then in the conversation, but to touch upon this, is there a trend of space weaponization?
Yeah, I think it depends on what you term as weaponization. I mean, when you talk about weapons, people think about sort of like either sort of like a nuclear warhead or sort of like a projectile, or the sort of scary space lasers. But actually, anything in the right hands can be a weapon. It could be another satellite can be used as a weapon. And particularly now we're seeing, and no doubt we'll come on to some vulnerabilities later on. Things like one of the big problems we have in space is orbital debris. And debris hitting other satellites can cause the Kessler effect, where sort of you get a lot of sort of like damage, causing then satellites break up into multiple parts. That then goes out and hits other multiple satellites, etc., etc. But anything that's used to deorbit or to collect debris can also be used as a weapon to deorbit a satellite that you don't want up there, or to interfere with a satellite in some way, or collect information from an asset in space. And we're seeing more and more these technologies that for debris, but also for life extension units. So the satellites up there are limited by the amount of fuel they carry. So we're seeing that these companies now that are out there, some of the big organizations, are putting these like orbital refuelers, where they have a secondary satellite that will then dock onto the primary, and then that will then extend the lifespan of the satellite. But again, using that technology to dock, that could be used for nefarious means as well as for positive means. So yes, there is much more weaponization in space, but it's not necessarily from the traditional sort of like the way that you think about as a weapon.
I know that we, in preparation for this, we also discussed kind of the policy angle, but I'd love to stick to a concept that you taught and explained well, which was PACE. You want to take a moment to tell me a bit, or the audience a bit, about PACE planning?
Yeah, so PACE planning is critical within a military context, and it stands for the PACE is the primary method of communications, an alternate, a contingency, and then also an emergency. And that's generally the way that planners will operate. They'll have at least those four methods of communication, and they could all be satellite based. They could be 3 satellite based, and then a sort of an HF based high frequency radio, and they could be different frequency bands, different orbits. But the whole idea is that you'll have like these different assets for use at different times. And with the PACE planning, traditionally your primary has been like a sovereign asset, a national spacecraft. The alternate has been a hardened an ally spacecraft, and then the contingency and emergency will be commercial assets, sort of secure commercial asset, and then a less secure commercial asset. But we're seeing more and more now that actually the primary is becoming a commercial asset of some sort with a secure overlay on it. So we're seeing militaries using commercial assets to provide their core communications, and then they're using the sovereign communications as a backup. And one of the advantages in that is that you get the much higher throughputs from a commercial asset. So you get much more data passed over the network.
I mean, that's certainly interesting and pretty good evidence on how both the commercial and the public sector assets are intertwined, but also this dual use technology you were mentioning about. So clearly, if we were to go back to our thesis statement, if we will, commercialization has very much created a new era of space militarization that isn't hypothetically weapons necessarily or anything too dire, but it opened up both opportunities in the technology to have multiple uses. While we intend much for the best, we shouldn't be blind to the potential misuses of new technologies. And that leads us to another theme that we spoke about. How will emerging technologies then, like AI, quantum, space-based lasers, autonomous drones, how will they be the ones, these new technologies, emerging technologies, shape militarization, space militarization? And how have they brought both the commercial and government's actors together? So kind of in the line of PACE.
And I think the way it's going to shape the future environment is just that speed of change, and the far wider ranging technologies that are going to be available with machine learning and AI, and then you get sort of like the sort of quantum encryption and lots of sort of new technologies that are coming through, which allow things to be much more quickly automated. And also things like with going back to the PACE planning, have that in autonomous, so that it is completely it can detect the very beginning of a threat or an attack, and then move to an alternate communications if it needs to. And we're seeing sort of a lot of the vulnerabilities up there is not necessarily about removing the capability. It could be degrading it through interference, whether deliberate or accidental interference, and it could be sort of like looking at like with the debris issues, and and things like, and some of the threats and vulnerabilities up there is things like dazzling of sensors using ground-based lasers, all the way up to something potentially sort of like taking out a complete orbit by putting a ballistic missile into an orbit and then taking out a satellite, which will then cause that Kessler effect. And what we're seeing is the ability to much more quickly work around those issues by having a self-healing network that will be able to detect and mitigate against those threats. And things like with interference, for instance, our organization has a technology called CSIR, CSIR, which allows you to then, even though you are being subject to interference and like noise, you can still work through that, and you can still operate effectively. And that's where I think a lot of these modern sort of like the newer technologies are coming through that allow us to keep working and also have that resilience and that reliability that's always going to be there. And there's lots of different technologies out there now, from layer 1 encryption, which encrypts the waveform itself, so it's very difficult even to see that there's something there in the first place. And then that brings in the concept of low probability of interception, low probability of detection. So if you don't know someone's there, it's very difficult to attack them in the first place. So I think having a lot of these technologies, they are commercially based technologies, and they work in a similar sort of way as like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth do, so you can have lots of different connections going at the same time. And we then employ that technology across onto a platform that can be used for either defense or commercial capabilities. And generally, I think you'll find that there's much more harmony in how the different commercial and government organizations want to have that communications, because they're working in an increasingly congested and contested environment.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. That was very thorough. I know it's a big theme since your industry days that we attended, and there were a lot of new technologies which seem almost basic. You stick a radar on the ground and you can, track and try and do anti-jamming technologies, or just understand where interference is coming from. I mean, it's so difficult when so much of space is either intangible or far too far away for it to be tangible immediately. And I appreciate the look as well into, I think, some points you made on Kessler effect, but also the sustainability of our use of space. Ultimately, we all have an interest, and governments do have an interest, in ensuring that it's a peaceful domain where everyone can operate successfully. And I think that motivation hasn't waned. That said, I think Mr. Steve Song asked a question, so something I'd like to go into. So Steve, if you allow, I'll change your question slightly, but are there any indexes of governments regarding, tracking how they use space defense, or how governments are preparing for space defense? And leading up to that, what other policies, or are there policy avenues for these treaties on space? I mean, perhaps bigger than what the ITU or the UN does. Is there any movement, transparency?
Yeah, and ultimately it's the International Telecommunications Union that controls sort of like the orbital slots and things like that, and the frequency uses. And then you have regional organizations like ETSI, the European, FTC in the US, and then you have like landing rights and national bodies that then control the frequencies and whether you can use a certain technology in a certain environment. But it's monitoring that to make sure that is one thing to say that a certain technology can be used in a land space or not, but then actually physically stopping that is another thing. So there has to be an element of willing willing ability to go along with that regulation as well. So you are relying on goodwill to a certain extent. but as far as the indexes on sort of like the militarization of space, there's lots of different organizations out there which provide papers, but there's
Hmm.
no real sort of one source, if you like. So there's the
Hmm.
European Space Policy Institute, UK Space, just to give two examples, and there's lots of other national bodies that bring out these white papers on defense use of space. But you have to sort of dig and plow through those. And I think that's where organizations like Access Partnerships can help and sort of like crystallize that, and maybe sort of look at specific regional questions or sort of like country down to the country level, and then
Hmm.
advise on where best to look. But yeah, the regulation is very it relies on people participating, and in large, particularly the spacefaring nations do comply
Yeah.
absolutely. Where we do have a potential issue is if you have a country that has nothing to lose, that don't particularly rely on space-based information or navigation or communications, but they do have the ability to launch an asset into space, then that's potentially where you have that issue of an asymmetric attack,
Hmm. Hmm.
where they are used to operating without it, but the nations that are now reliant on space then have to relearn how to operate without that. And there's this whole concept of days without space, that where if you have a major incident, and that could be something man-made, but also it could be, and we've seen recently some fantastic northern light displays. But actually, that space weather can cause serious disruption to our spacecraft and to our capabilities. And if you have an event that removes or sort of the capability, then you have to be able to operate without that. And that's where having that pace planning, not just involving space, having ground-based assets as well, but also multi-orbit approach can really help build the resiliency against that. So regulation is there, but it does rely on that goodwill, and it does rely on people. It's like any sort of any legal system. People have to comply by the rules, and all you need is one person or one country or one group to not comply by the rules, and then everybody's life becomes that bit more difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I know a lot of my colleagues work with, around the ITU, and I can understand what a difficult and complex system it took to create, and that's just managing orbits. But I can also attest to how much faith there is in the ITU in that system, and when you believe in it, it very much becomes its own regulatory framework. I also think one thing that you mentioned, which is interesting, is mutual accountability, but there's almost nothing to hold transparent, as in I wouldn't be able to identify immediately which countries service what type of assets, what extent they're dual use. I mean, when I used to track everything launched, but Gunter's space page is great at providing all the data, but there's only so much that's available. So if there's one call I perhaps can conclude from what we said is an increase of transparency, effective policies, not to stunt the growth of spacefaring nations, but to keep space for its peaceful uses, which is very much UNOSA's intent as well. You did talk about weather, but I see a question from Freya in the chat. Are there any concerns for the Earth's environment? And I think we mentioned a little bit about SSA, SDA, but suppose if you have any insights on that, feel free if it's not your area.
I wouldn't say there's necessarily concerns about the Earth environment, but it is that it comes back to that sustainable and that responsible approach, particularly on low Earth orbits. The way that we get rid of an orbit that's in geosynchronous or geostationary orbit, it's 36,000 kilometers away, so we can't bring it back to Earth. We just turn it around and use the last bit of fuel to push it out that little bit further. But with low Earth orbit, we actually deorbit these satellites and we slow them down, and they come down to Earth in a controlled environment or controlled way. If we lose control over those satellites, that's when it becomes difficult, and that's where they could be landing in places they shouldn't be landing. But I think generally speaking, there's more positive use of space to protect the environment, to monitor the environment, and particularly sort of like we now see satellites that are being used to actively monitor pollution, and also things like oil spills to stop ships from deliberately purging their tanks when they shouldn't be outside of a port. We now can build evidence and sort of gain evidence of that so that we can prosecute and stop people from doing it. So I'd say there's probably more positive implications than there are negative, but it's something we do need to watch. And over a period of time, one of the things that I think we'll see, and this is personal opinion, is we'll start to see some more mining of space and reclaiming of space assets, because it will become more cost effective to get some of the materials from space than it will be to get them from the Earth. Or there'll be political control of those minerals or sort of like assets down on the ground that it's necessary to get them from space. And there's a lot of sort of materials and minerals up there in space that we could then reuse and recycle. And I think that might make positive impacts on the Earth, that you're not then having to excavate some of these minerals from the ground. We can then recycle and reuse them. But that's more of a long-term aspiration of mine. But I think I'll see when it becomes cost effective, we'll see that happening more and more.
Okay. I think that's a fair point as well. I think what it shows most of all is that space continues to be an extremely useful component for both the Earth's future, humanity's future, for us observations. So I think there's a potentially even more driving force and need for us to protect it. But as very much the theme of the space militarization, I suppose another question I wanted to ask is if those, in your opinion, are conflicting themes, and if we see any trend moving towards, in some cases, some governments seem to be more protectionist. In a lot of other cases as well, you see spacefaring nations wanting to take a forefront using comms or EO systems for their own for their own accessibility, for their own networks, and could come at the detriment of collaboration. Everyone wants access to space. Everyone wants their own systems in space, which is fantastic. But it sometimes feels as though a lot of incoming policies are, as I said, that protectionist angle, that riding on the hype of militarization, maybe a bit out of touch or forgetting how much history has brought us to where we are. I don't know if you share the sentiment or if you have any words of insight from industry.
Yeah, I think there's certainly a danger of protectionism, but I think on the positive side, I think space is one of the last bastions of international collaboration, and we've seen it in recent times where you still have the ISS still has sort of like multiple nations up there all working together, all for sort of like the greater good and sort of like science and research there. But then you also have, there's some big nations that are involved in space that aren't part of the ISS, and they're going down their own paths, and they have their own sort of like space vehicles up there. And I think the wider collaboration is potentially coming to a point now where we're starting to see the demise of it, and we are starting to see that bit more of a protectionism that is encroaching. And I think really, global collaboration, I think, is definitely, as far as space goes, it's definitely the way to go. But you do have to be aware that not all nations share that view. And I think there's a danger of taking the protectionist view to combat against that. But I think that is something that I think nations should think long and hard about before they actually do. And we're seeing predominantly on the commercial side, there's a number of large organizations that are streets ahead, and I think of SpaceX and Amazon particularly, where they're going to be providing that commercial capability. And then obviously those organizations will come under more scrutiny and control of their home nation than they would have elsewhere. So it's not just that direct protectionism, it's also an inferred protectionism through country of origin as well.
An interesting one on that. So I saw recently the US published its strategy on space commercialization, in which they also directly mentioned that the US government intends to continue obtaining commercial contracts for its space defense needs, and it has the Space Force. So they see it as a very symbiotic relationship. But I also want to take a leaf out of recent history, whereas SpaceX was operating in Ukraine, it's selling its capabilities as well to Russian counterparts. And when you mentioned, governments wanting to both increase and continue using commercialization as evident by the US's strategy, but you had said this home nation scrutiny. I suppose I want to ask how you feel it's that trend of commercialization, but nation scrutiny is continuing, and how it's changing the space sector. So outcasts from that, not just the SpaceX example, but we're seeing so many operators come together. I mean, we saw the Intelsat SES announcement. You see GSO and NGSO networks having to find their way around each other. You see Earth observation companies coming to combine their services. So you're having international companies that may have sell major contracts to their governments, but if you have different companies from various governments, where is that national scrutiny coming from? Or was that trend of commercialization flip national scrutiny, and who is how accountable? I think that's kind of a dilemma that hasn't yet found its resolution.
Yeah, and I think that's still playing out to a certain extent. And I think certainly from a military perspective, it comes back to that pace approach, that you're not over reliant on one specific communications method, that you have those multiple methods. So if one of them does disappear, either because of a technical issue or because there's been a decision to stop that service over that geographic location for a period of time, then you have other assets that you can use and then you can fall back on. And again, not necessarily space-based, that you do have those ground assets. You go back to your UHF and HF and other sort of like terrestrial communications methods. But what I think is still playing out in the space environment with the consolidation, we're seeing a lot of mergers and acquisition. We are seeing that consolidation is mirroring what sort of happened in the mobile phone industry decades before. And we'll see that going forward on 5G, 6G technologies. We'll see a coming together of terrestrial and space-based assets, so that you will have that sort of that multiple roaming capability, and almost you won't care which one your data is being transferred over, be that space-based or terrestrial-based. It will be the best option at any given point. And we're now seeing, particularly on a commercial environment in the mobile phone world, you don't care and you don't even know what it's going over. As long as you've got connectivity, that's all that matters. And what we're seeing now is a drive towards a software-defined platform. Our latest remote is a software-defined remote that gives connectivity over our native systems, but also can quite happily support other waveforms as well. So you can see it being used across different networks, different orbits, different frequency bands, and ultimately the end user will have that connectivity, and they won't have to think about that pace planning because it's all built into the network. But even then, you would still make sure you have those contingencies just in case.
Interesting. Yeah, I recognize you SD Engineering has quite some new technologies that I'm relatively unfamiliar with. It seems like everything is always modular, and ultimately the user, even governments in this case, as long as my information is safe, secure, and encrypted, I can communicate successfully. And that, I think, brings me to another question that I had a bit more on the technical side. I mean, ideas, I'd say now the currency when it comes to space is data. Its war is very much related to data, militarization, but also peace times. The more data you have, the more information. It's always been a management of information. So if we're talking about militarization trends, I heard you say a few times the term resilience. I think that's a buzzword that we wouldn't be without. How would you see resilience, or the trend of resilience, in militarization? Do you think it underpins that? And how has ST Engineering changed its services and products, and thereby your work and your technical expertise, to match that? If I'm right in understanding, your sales and strategies had to change to fit it. So from an industry perspective, what does resilience mean to you, and what do you think is the main currency now when it comes to militarization in space?
I think resilience is not about not being attacked or not about not being overcome by a threat. It's
Mhm.
how quickly do you bounce back after that. So and it's mitigating that impact. And some of the technologies we have originally were designed to work around some of the frequency bands are affected quite heavily by weather, particularly
Mhm.
rain, fog, mist, snow. And we designed a technology that would adapt around that, so that if you get an increasing amount of rain, for instance, then we'll change our waveform to become more robust and be able to work and we do it in a way that your throughput does slowly drop down, but you maintain that connectivity.
Mhm.
And also with that interference, that scissor that I talked about earlier, is that you can still work and operate in that environment, and you can still maintain that connectivity. And I think it's having that capability. And as far as the approach goes, that you make sure that you've got connection of some sort, but also you need to manage the sort of the expectations of the user. The user has to be able to operate in an environment where they don't have that same connectivity. They can work with
Mhm.
reduced connectivity. So it comes down to operating in an environment and exercising in an environment where you have limited bandwidth and limited throughputs. And generally speaking, the military use cases, they'll rely on a low throughput, but then
Mhm.
they'll push to a high throughput as and when they need to. And particularly some of the NATO forces use this term of mission command,
Mhm.
where everybody on the ground understands the intent of the mission, and they will do what they need in order to maintain that mission and to make sure it's successful. And they could do that without necessarily communicating back to the main headquarters at any one time. So you have these multiple levels and these multiple layers of resilience
Mhm.
that allow you to continue operating. And if you think about it, it's a bit like a fort where you have your forward teams out on the ground that are disturbing the enemy. You'll have your moat, then you'll have your walls, then you'll have your inside bastion, and that's that sort of approach of having these multiple layers of protection, and this capability of using different types of technology allow you to maintain that information flow throughout, depending on what you're doing.
I like that definition of resilience. I think it's a pretty accurate way to see both how policy and commercial needs are diverging. And since we're talking about the balance to the one, it seems like it's very hand in hand game. So I'm especially keen to see how some of the technologies we were mentioning earlier and some of the products that I've recently seen from you, how they're changing that. And I think I agree. It's certainly what the user wants at the end, and wherever the user is, they want to be connected. They want to have their own network. They want privacy. And the more information you have, the bigger of a leg up you have as well. I just want to take a quick look into any of the other comments we have before we start wrapping up slowly. Thank you, Hector, for your question, Hector Falcon. How have partnerships been impacted due to this militarization on orbit and potentially across orbits? Are all platforms, waveforms fair game in the age of dynamic payloads?
Okay, so I would say the partnerships, and actually, I would say the partnerships have probably been impacted more by the increased and rapid increase of commercialization. So there's a lot more options out there that's driving down cost. So some of the bigger organizations are having to then look at look at themselves and look at how do they become more effective and more efficient, and quite often in the industry that comes down to mergers and acquisition, and we've seen that in sort of like across the whole telecommunications industry, and it's increasingly in the space industry as well. And SES and Intelsat, the recent announcement is an example of that. But before that, we've had OneWeb and Eutelsat, we've had Viasat and Inmarsat. My own company, ST Engineering, iDirect and NewTek two modem technologies coming together, one known for its efficiencies, one known for its security and mobility. Bring those together, and then you have the best of breed platform going forward, which we call intuition. And then there's a defense flavor of that called revolution as well. And you'll see more about that in sort of future sort of months and years. But I think to answer the question about is everything fair game, I think this becomes very, very complex very, very quickly. And this is where, and I think we've seen it on the battlefield with vehicles, for instance, that people will just use sort of like Toyota Hiluxes or something like that rather than an armored vehicle, and they rely on that rapid capability. It doesn't mean that then Toyota becomes a target. However, if you're actively passing communications for various defense forces, it could be interpreted that you then become a legitimate target. And this is where we have to rely on regulation, we have to rely on international cooperation, and we have to rely on dialogue to make sure that we don't then sort of cross the Rubicon into an environment where it then becomes like an all-out symmetric war, rather than what we've seen in the last sort of few decades, which is more of asymmetric operations. And I would like to think that the politicians and the governments of the day will do everything they can in order to avoid that situation. And but yeah, that's more my hope. But there is potential certainly for that escalation.
I was gonna say, relying on regulation, it's an interesting kind of approach when we said earlier that there isn't much of regulation out there, and policymakers, they also struggle to keep up with the increasing emerging technologies and the new trends. And while space tech has lead times completely different than the technology sector, just because you have a longer lead time doesn't mean the technology is any less complex. So I am also pretty keen in seeing how things move forward. When it comes to Hector's questions on waveforms and platforms, I think we'll have to lean and look at the ITU. Each 4 years, there's new agenda items that I think touch upon these. But when it comes to waveforms, I think ITU has that. I understand every government has to register their frequencies like the rest of them. So conversations are fair in that sense. And even with NATO calling space its next, crucial domain, it plays by rules like any other domain, and that there is international accountability. So especially keen to see how that keeps going when we look at space situational awareness and SDA as well. Tracking debris and movement, which satellite might have to get out of the way of the other one. All of these unending questions with an increased use of space and space technologies. I'm sure politicians will have to be flexible.
And I think that's one of the key things with space situational awareness, or SDA, space domain awareness. There is that increased need to have that attributable evidence, so that you monitor what's going on up there, and then increasingly you'll see satellites that will have sensors around them, and they will have sort of like cohort satellites around them in order to monitor and sort of like alarm if they see things happening. And then having that sort of attributable evidence then allows you to then sort of take action if required, or at least lodge a complaint if required. So having that evidence-based approach does make a difference as well.
An evidence-based approach. Well, then I guess your call to policymakers will be to keep having honest conversations with industry for that evidence. If I can jump to my next question as we wrap up slowly, I suppose, what is your call to policymakers? Since I identified that that's kind of a gap in what we've been speaking about. Evident, the trend of commercialization is strong. It's changed what space defense is and the relationship of the two. Militarization is a very real trend, and new technologies are affecting it, but also new systems, the conglomeration of the sector, and how companies are coming together. I note that there's still national priorities when it comes to space militarization, but governments are looking for fast-moving, reliable assets, which the commercial market has been developing successfully, and governments don't seem deterred from choosing commercial players. What that looks like in terms of national accountability, time will tell. With more use cases, I suppose we'll see that. What regulation looks like, time will tell. Once again, we have more use cases. So I suppose my last question to you slowly, and I hope if anybody has any other questions, you can put it in the chat now. What is your call to action? Do you have any concerns, anything you're looking forward to? What do you want to tell policymakers or even your fellow members of industry?
And I think as far as policy goes, I mean, it's just remaining flexible and trying to keep up with the pace of change, which is easier said than done. And I think that doesn't just we're talking in the framework of communications and sort of Earth observation, orbital slots. But actually, if you imagine any fast changing environment, trying to keep a legal framework around that and keep it flexible enough to cater for most scenarios, but then also robust enough to provide a deterrence is very, very difficult. So I absolutely understand that. But I think the key thing for industry, full stop, is collaboration. It's that open collaboration, having that open approach, and you'll see it more as we go towards a sort of like a virtualized environment where you have very much a cloud-based technology and this software-defined networking that allows the different organizations to work together. But ultimately for the end user, they don't want to carry 5 different pieces of equipment. They want to carry just one item that does everything. Now you will have backups and you will have resilience built into that system. But ultimately, I mean, for the warfighter on the ground, they do not change how much they carry. They will always carry the same amount of weight, but depending on what the communications equipment is, the less communications equipment they carry, it means they can carry more ammunition and more water. So you'll see over a period of time that communications equipment will get smaller, but it gets more capable. And I think that's where we're going, that collaboration in order to have that a better technology for the warfighters on the ground, but also more control and flexibility so that they can have that resilience built in from the ground up. And that's where some of the sort of like the AI type technologies that will automatically tune that pace approach will come into it more and more.
Well, thank you. Thanks again, Dave, for your time. I always appreciate catching up with you, and it's been a very fruitful conversation. I think we touched on a lot. If somebody would play militarization bingo, I hope someone got bingo at this point. I look forward for the opportunity to speak with you again on this theme. Thank you, everybody that tuned in online. And if you have any other questions, you can always reach us on our Access Partnership YouTube page or on our website, or Dave through the ST Engineering website as well. So thanks everybody for joining in, and have a lovely rest of your week. Thanks, Dave.
Well, thank you very much.